Greetings adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. Playing with longtime friends in a tabletop role-playing game is one of the greatest feelings, until one person decides that they're going to turn harmless in-game arguments into real-life grudges. For some reason, one person at every table tends not to realize that a role-play game is going to have the occasional role-playing in it, so even if it makes you feel like you're being condescending sometimes, it might not hurt to clarify that just because your frenzied berserker of a barbarian is tearing into their character, that doesn't mean that you guys aren't still chill. I think you'll understand what I mean after I read today's story. Hey kid, want to try some Gamersupps? You can now get free samples anywhere in the world and try the most delicious 0-calorie energy powder in the game when you use code LootGoblin. Each sample sent out gets me one step closer to my quest to get a flavor that tastes suspiciously like Dr. Pepper. If you end up liking those free samples and want to purchase some Gamersupps, make sure to use the link in the description or use my code to get 10% off your entire order. Anyways, back to the video. Today's treasure was actually submitted by someone in the community and goes by "Am I the a-hole for trying to kill the pacifist?" To start off, I want to say that I'm really into roleplay. I consider myself a novice artist, love creating character designs, and coming up with backstories. Combat is fun, but deep down, roleplay is what I enjoy the most as a Dungeons & Dragons player, and is what makes my little theater kid heart happy. I fear me taking the roleplay very seriously has caused issues in our campaign, but I wanted to hear some other opinions on the situation. This will be a little long, apologies. To start, my character is a chaotic neutral barbarian pirate captain. In her backstory, I wrote her parents were pacifists who failed to protect her and her siblings. Therefore, she resents them and all other pacifists and strives to be stronger, richer, more cutthroat than anyone else on the seas in order to protect what's important to her. She has difficulty controlling her emotions and taking accountability, which was something I was hoping the found family aspect of Dungeons & Dragons groups would help soften and teach her some things. She also has an adopted goblin son and a long-lost brother whom she was eventually reunited with in the story. Our party also had a rogue, druid, paladin, and a sorcerer. For a little context, we were all in real life friends prior to this campaign, and this was the longest campaign any of us have been in so far, and our Dungeon Master's first ever full-length campaign, besides running pre-written one-shots here and there. Our druid and rogue decided their characters would be siblings, and our druid, who always likes to add quirks to their characters, narcoleptic characters, short-term memory loss, etc., decided their druid would be a pacifist due to their traumatic backstory, which resulted in the death of their mother. So, from the get-go, our characters fundamentally did not get along. The druid character was very helpful in investigation and buffs in combat, however, would often push the envelope of what abilities could do. For example, insisting to the Dungeon Master that a crab was an insect that could be enlarged, or that a jail cell has vegetation growing in it that they could speak to for information. The other players, including myself, would notice this, and the Dungeon Master would initially tell the player these things did not work according to the rules / the story's setting. The player would continually insist that these things made sense until eventually the Dungeon Master would be worn down and allow it. You know what, sure, a crab is a bug. You know what, fine. I guess the jail has a little moss, etc. There was a moment where the player wild shaped for a long time. The party was split and they were essentially alone as an animal with a friendly NPC. They were huffing and puffing because they couldn't communicate with any players as an animal, so the Dungeon Master said, yeah, you know what, this NPC actually does speak a little bit of horse, which at the end of the day, what the Dungeon Master allows is what goes. But it was very evident that they did not want to upset the player and halt them from doing fun druid things. Okay, you know what, that horse comment is totally something I'd do as a Dungeon Master if I'm just like, oh, let's move this along. But yeah, someone who's trying to constantly break the rules as written, trying to always get an edge in their way, but then kind of huffs and puffs when stuff backfires or isn't edged towards them, is a really annoying thing to deal with. I'm going to be honest here, you know, I might always be biased a little bit towards the author because they can curate the story. And obviously as a viewer, I want to be a little more lenient as well. It's a little bit of a bias I have here, but truth be told, I think we've all run into a druid like this. Maybe they're not playing druid necessarily, but there's someone who takes their spell list and says, yeah, this should work because, and then they just talk so long that you say, you know what, we're not here to argue the rules of the game. We will let you have this marginal advantage, and then they keep taking it over and over again until suddenly they're the most powerful character in the game, just because the Dungeon Master doesn't want to spend 20 minutes in real life fighting with them. Now back to the story. The pacifism aspect is where I think the problem started. The druid consistently would complain that they didn't get to do anything. In combat, they got very hurt quickly and didn't prepare any spells that did harm at all. They only included spells to heal and buff us. This was the player's choice, of course, but it became quite frustrating to hear again and again the complaint of not getting to do anything when the player is the one who chose this route for their character. Yeah, I could see that getting old quick. it seemed to become cyclical. The player would complain, the Dungeon Master would give in, they would get a rule bent here, a cool item there, or plot hook, and they would complain again. Since the Dungeon Master was newer, I could understand him wanting to make sure everyone was having a good time, but it started to feel at some point the character was receiving special treatment just because the player was never satisfied. Eventually, the pacifist Druid was slain in battle, failed all death saves, etc. The Dungeon Master allowed the character's brother, our rogue, to essentially switch places with the Druid due to some cursed item he had. This led our party on an adventure to the Feywild, where the Druid is from, and to try and retrieve their brother's soul. This led to the Druid's character's main arc, and eventually one of the main villains, their father. Yeah, that right there is a great example of favoritism. So the Druid character dies, and instead of them going to the Feywild to rescue her, the brother has to die in her place, and then she gets to be the hero for dying. Yeah, that's some clear favoritism. This also caused our rogue player to make a temporary character while on this mission to retrieve his first character's soul. He eventually ended up liking his second character's story more, and when the arc ended, he chose to continue with the new one, which made the Druid player incredibly angry at the player in real life. The Druid and rogue were siblings, and the Druid player was also having a hard time justifying their character moving on to the next chapter without their brother. They eventually had to give in, and it was the rogue player's choice as per our Dungeon Master, but the scene that was supposed to be a heartfelt goodbye turned out to be incredibly tense and blunt, and made the Druid's character seem very angry at their brother rather than sad. Now back to the Feywild arc. The Druid's father ended up summoning a huge monster that immediately flew to our backline and slaughtered our character's NPC family in one turn. After the battles were won, the Dungeon Master allowed the Druid to reincarnate my character's son and brother, turning them into completely different races. The Dungeon Master also decided that because of the aging differences between races, my character's son was no longer a child but a teenager due to the new race aging faster. Now above board, I'm well aware this is our Dungeon Master raising the stakes, creating a reason for my character to go full throttle, etc. But when thinking about what my hot-headed barbarian would do, who already had a disdain for pacifism in her backstory, the only immediate mindset that I could come up with for her would be to blame the Druid. Yes, the Druid brought them back, but they look different and aged differently. The way my character saw it, the fact that Druid couldn't fight is what got them there in the first place, and was the reason people were getting killed around them. So we roleplayed the argument, and my character let the Druid have it, explaining this and essentially calling them useless and someone who gets people hurt. Again, I know the Druid has been helpful by giving out buffs and RP-wise as a player, but I was trying to embody the feelings and again lack of accountability / emotional instability my character would have in the situation. Deep down, my character would come to realize she blames herself for not being strong enough to protect her people, but we weren't at that point yet in her character development. Now, this may be my fault for trying to theorize or expect what the outcome of this tongue lashing would be, but much to my and my character's shock, the Druid met us with an "Are you done?" instead of any kind of apology, taking accountability, or condolences whatsoever. Up until then, the Druid's character seemed very much a staunch pacifist and an empath. I can't tell someone how to roleplay their character, but from my experience with the player as a friend, it felt more like in the moment, they let their own personality come through in response rather than the character. And yeah, that's one of the hardest things about roleplaying. Your two characters really should hate each other. You have a clear arc that makes sense, and you guys have very staunch reasons why you two would hold your beliefs, both tied to family. But no matter how good the roleplay situation is, you always run the risk that someone else isn't taking the roleplay seriously. They're checking in and out, or sometimes they just have the inability to separate themselves from the character. So that's a good thing that you pointed out, that maybe they took it personally or they're responding as themselves and not the character in question. Some people just can't handle aggression, even if it's in the context of a fun roleplay situation where a more weathered group or just a more comfortable group could laugh it off as a really fun moment in the story. Think of any group in a TV, movie, in a game that has a moment where two people in the party just have a crash out on each other and it helps move forward the story. That's something that is cool and you can create in Dungeons and Dragons, but we're not all professionals, so sometimes people will just react as themselves or sit on it for a while and blow up later, and that is a really hard thing to do when you're playing with friends and it's supposed to be fun. Alright, let's jump back in the story. Again, not my place to say what another character should or shouldn't do, but the fact is that "Are you done?" was what was said in the moment, which only enraged my barbarian more. The argument ended there, as my barbarian wouldn't have found it satisfying to physically fight someone who couldn't fight back. I actually took to messaging my Dungeon Master and the player to try and set up some form of heart-to-heart, maybe have my character's brother intervene and convince my character to try and talk it out. The Druid player actually said, "I don't think our characters will ever get along after this," which was fine by me. The player and I multiple times would joke about the fact fact that our characters hated each other now, but we were still friends in real life, even sending each other TikTok memes about it. Okay, that's good to see at least. The next arc comes along, there's still tension. We were at our paladin's underwater kingdom and found out that he was a runaway prince. The kingdom was very war and violence centered, perfect for my barbarian. A separate character disagreement between my barbarian and our paladin had me cooking up a potential crash out arc for my character to have had our arguments escalate further, which I had messaged my dungeon master and our paladin about since the start of this new arc. But of course, again, the druid complains that they did not get to do anything since a lot of the arc revolved around a Coliseum 1v1 fight to the death tournament, which the druid obviously chose not to participate in. Halfway through the arc, the druid character had a separate personal disagreement with our sorcerer's character. We found out that the sorcerer character had been watching the druid reincarnate people from body parts and chose to start stealing body parts / ashes of our main enemies in secret in order to prevent other people from bringing them back, as the character did not fully understand how reincarnation worked. The sorcerer stole the druid's evil father's ashes and the druid found out. So this, coupled with my character's comment towards the druid, had the player message the dungeon master, and essentially they were allowed to set up that the druid turns evil. Mind you, the paladin and I both messaged our dungeon master about having our own duels since the start of the arc, which got completely sidelined by this event. The druid essentially got influenced by the big bad evil guy cult entity to magically summon all the party to its lair, including my character's NPC family, who were specifically dropped off in a safe place to avoid any harm to them. The party had to go one by one and tried to talk down the druid and left it at my character, who is still angry from the last arguments and is now furious that the druid essentially brought her family into peril again. So instead of trying to talk down the druid in a kind way, I felt it more in character to threaten them, essentially saying, if you hurt my people again, there will be consequences. The druid player then actually proceeded to tell us specifically as a party that my character's comments had the druid choose to follow through with turning evil and becoming a boss. It was a very grueling boss fight. The pacifist was no longer a pacifist and instead had a bunch of necrotic dead raising abilities. One of the goons ended up killing my character's son again. The good guys in the party ended up making a group chat so that we could talk game plan and what our characters intend to do here. I totally get the idea of a character siding with the villain because of something that lines up with their backstory and the villain kind of resonates with them, but at that point you kind of just hand over the character sheet to the dungeon master and you roll someone new in the party. I feel the same way when it comes to someone who always wants to leave the party continuously to go run off on their own. At a certain point, if the character has no real intent to come back, I just ask them, hey, are you retiring your character? Because if they're going to go west and the party's going to go east for this quest, there's no reason why I should keep humoring your roles. This is no longer someone part of the party. In fact, you don't even need other players to play a TTRPG if you really want to be solo. It just usually isn't as fulfilling, so making the Dungeon Master play a one-on-one game with you when everyone agreed to sit down as like, say, 5 people is pretty selfish. Alright, let's get back to the story. Here's the thing, I know PvP is generally looked down upon, let alone killing another player character. I would argue he's an NPC by this point, but let's continue. But from how I saw it, I did not think at this point in time my character's comments would let this go without at least trying to kill the druid. My character lost her family multiple times due to situations revolving around the druid's pacifism, and now the druid's feelings being hurt. Many of the party members agreed, and we chatted about the druid's character and how we didn't understand how these personal party arguments justified the druid siding with the big bad evil guy and trying to kill us. We were also commenting during the fight in the chat about how badly we needed this character gone. After the fight ended, my character tried to finish the job, while the paladin and another party member tried to protect the druid. All of the party members argued back and forth whether or not the druid should get to live after that / travel with us. A party member used Revivify on my barbarian's son, who was able to talk her down enough to not finish the job. Apparently, after this argument, the druid player also complained that they did not have a say in whether they lived or died, in which I'd argue it was an open floor for conversation and they did not speak up once. Yeah, I don't think the druid's vote counts for much here. After the fight, the paladin player for some reason decided to include the druid player in our group chat, where they saw us talking about how we didn't understand the druid's motivations at this point and how our characters most likely were going to try and kill the druid. The druid then messages the dungeon master and sends us a paragraph about how it's important to respect each other's characters, and we all knew immediately this was about what was said in the group chat. The player said we killed their motivation to play and they just want to get the next arc over with, but they still intend to play with us in campaign 2. We apologize for making the player upset, but when it comes down to it, nothing inaccurate to the story was said in the group chat, nor was anything said negatively about the player. It was mostly the party scratching our heads as to why the druid got to this point and saying that from our character's point of view, they do not understand this choice and they really do not want them around and either want the druid dead or out of the party. One of our other players did call the druid character a bitch in our group chat for counterspelling him at level 7, but again, this was completely in the moment saltiness and directed at the character, never the player. Honestly, taking the story at face value, that group chat might be one of the most tame ones I've ever seen. This feels a little bit like the Dungeon Master is afraid to put his foot down at all because they know that everyone else is more agreeable than the druid, and all they have to do is appease the druid a little bit and they can just continue all being friends. This is one thing that does really suck when a friend group is amazing out of game, but I feel like sometimes when I read these RPG horror stories, you kind of wonder if it's just a veil off moment when they're playing in game, especially if they're a terrible role player. They can only play the characters as themselves. It's a bit of a self-report. I hope that's not the case here. Let's see how it resolves. Here's the thing, at the end of the day, the druid player is my friend in real life, and I never wanted to make them feel bad for playing a game. But from how the roleplay had gone, the events of the story, and the players saying the character chose to fight against us, I also don't know what else they were expecting. The fun in D&D for me comes from these consequences to our actions. Yes, it's fun to crash out and have an evil arc, but it should be understood that the rest of the party is going to have difficulty justifying keeping you around, especially when it's made known that it wasn't a complete possession of the character's mind, but instead there was a deliberate choice made to hurt us. I was planning to have a fight with the Paladin too, which didn't pan out, and was able to comprehend that that may come with considerable consequences for my character's actions. It's kind of blown over at this point. We're in our final fight, and the Dungeon Master kind of realized he's been letting this player push the envelope with their abilities and finally set his foot down, which has made it for a harder battle for us, but also has been satisfying, in which the druid has yet again complained that they can't do anything, etc., and has been either dead silent, checked out, or made passive-aggressive comments. At the end of the day, I felt like my roleplay was mostly appropriate for the character I was trying to convey. I guess it just irks me that a player is able to complain and whine their way into changing their character's personality, abilities, and even become an evil boss, and they still feel that it's not enough and that we are not respecting their character after their evil switch up. Was I thinking too deeply into the roleplay aspect, and am I in the wrong for an attempt on the druid's life? Is PvP or attempted murder on a player character ever something that can be justified within a campaign storyline? Now that I've had a little time to reflect on the story, I realized I was just overthinking it. Yeah, I was trying to give you the best benefit of the doubt to explain why it could be a bad scenario, but the way you laid it out, if it played out how it played out, even if what you did was called attempted murder by the druid, if I'm reading this correctly, there are 4 players, and even if you don't count the NPCs as party members, some people consider their pet equivalent to PvP as well. The druid tried killing all 3 of you guys, right? I'm not missing anything. Even if you were guilty, they're triple guilty. But I would argue outright, and I kind of talked about this earlier, the moment they became an evil boss, they were just that. They're an NPC now. And it's such a sudden and aggressive turn that I actually get not killing the druid in the encounter because you're going to check if they were possessed or something. But the moment the druid's character confirms that, no, that was on purpose, 100% me, I do it again if you let me, I wouldn't be surprised if you were allowed to execute them on the spot. Maybe it's a cool character moment that you spare them, but they're definitely kicked out of the party. That goes without saying. There is no scenario where I would let that druid back in the party. I'm not talking about the person, I'm talking about the character. I don't want to sound too harsh on your friend, but I feel like they might have a little bit of a main character complex. Even taking in any bias that might come from the fact that you submitted the story, you got a little chance to curate it, and as a viewer, I'm going to be a little bit easier on you if you were the a-hole, which you aren't. The fact that they became a boss fight and still felt entitled to stay, and felt that they should make it clear that this was a willing boss fight and not just an unfortunate possession situation. Yeah, this is a slam dunk. You're in the clear. And the druid should have stayed clear of the party. I want to hear the thoughts of everyone in the comments here. I feel like you're going to find a lot of people agreeing with you. Overall though, it was a very fun, compelling read. For anyone ever looking to have a story be read on this channel, you can send it to lukegoblinstories@gmail.com. I had such a backlog of stories that I haven't really gotten a chance to dive into it, but now that I've read this story, I'm definitely going to read more. I'm going to try to do some longer videos where there's a bunch of them in one if it's a bunch of medium-sized stories. This one was a good length though, so it was perfect as its own standalone video, so I really appreciate that. And I hope you guys can show your appreciation by liking and subscribing to the channel, and as always, sharing your thoughts below. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Farewell for now.